Hello everybody, welcome to the panel VR and Body Ownership. What will happen to you when you immerse yourself in a virtual environment non-stop for 14 days, living the life of a different person? We simply don't know yet. Mark Farid becomes the first VR astronaut to live for such a long time in this new type of reality. Being confronted with this impact of virtual reality, we can start to ask questions about our experience of the physical world. According to philosopher Thomas Metzinger, our experience of reality is actually a mental model. We use something like a biological interface, translating information into colors, objects, sense of time, but also a sense of self, having agency. This body feels mine because I can move my arm. This form of illusion makes it possible for us to use all kinds of technical prosthetics, which can be owned by our own sense of self. Miguel, Ángel and Rego will dig deeper into how this sense of self comes about. And we also invited Dr. Mavi Sánchez-Vives to take part of the panel discussion. She will also give a short presentation. And she will give a keynote later tonight, which I can really recommend, where consequences and scenarios of these kinds of developments and scientific insights are explored. So I'm happy our guests can make us more acquainted with these type of technologies and new forms of relating to our sense of self and the world. It's time to introduce our moderator, Dr. Natalie Dixon. She's the co-founder of Effect Lab in Amsterdam, interdisciplinary research studio. Dixon's research explores issues of belonging, otherness, race and gender through the lens of media and technology. Her research has been published in multiple international peer reviews and in different journals. Most recently, she was awarded with the 2018-19 at New Institute Fellowship for a project titled How to Read a Story About Burnout that explored gender, migration, women's work and burnout. Dixon is visiting lecturer at the Artes University of Arts in Arnhem, where she's currently developing a vision for the Body Lab to explore human-technology relationship and sensory methods for design. She's an alumni of the University of Amsterdam and Goldsmith College in London. Natalie.
Thanks for that intro, Jan, and I'm very excited to be here today. A warm welcome to you. And this is hopefully going to be a very interesting afternoon. I'm so curious to know what's going to happen in our discussion and, of course, your talks. I'd like to introduce Mark Farid first. He is a conceptual artist who examines how our projected self is formed and how our construction of identity is shaped by society. Mark graduated from Kingston University in London with a first-class honours degree in fine arts in 2014 and has since given talks and participated in group and solo exhibitions throughout Europe, the UAE and Japan. I watched his 2017 TEDx talk. I can highly recommend it. It delves into his projects called Data Shadow, which happened in 2015, and Poisonous Antidote, 2016, both extremely interesting. They challenged accepted norms about privacy, surveillance, and notions of self. He took part in the Sundance New Frontier program in 2016 for an ongoing project, which I'm sure he'll tell us more about, called Seeing Eye. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you. Is it? Can I go? Thank you. No? Cool. Cool. Yeah, so I'm here to talk about Seeing Eye, which is a very kind, nice, warm introduction. So yeah, we'll start with a trailer to the project, and then we'll get into it.
In this playground of immortality, The preservation of experience has taken hold of our existence. We're able to stay connected even when hiding from one another. The illusion of companionship without the demands of relationships. We choose to text rather than talk. Where we are but simulations, we cannot be ourselves. These simulations blur the lines between fiction and reality. And when they permeate back into our lives, they obscure the sense of ourselves and of one another. Where both spectator and spectacle inhabit this blurred reality, eroding individuality and the sanctity of consciousness. Because we've grown up with technology, we assume technology has grown up too. We're being isolated as it continues to progress. And as we've never been taught how to be alone, we only know how to be lonely. The distinction between physical reality and its simulation is blurring. And if our consciousness is experienced through the perception of sight and sound, through interaction, through technology, and through our conception of knowledge, to what extent is it really our own?
So yeah, next year, for 24 hours a day for 14 days, I'll wear a virtual reality headset, only seeing and hearing what one person sees and hears for 2 weeks. This person, who we call the other, and is a stranger to me, wear a custom-built recorder which records a 220-degree field of view left and right, and 165 degrees up and down. This is because peripheral vision is 210 by 150, so we've got slightly more each way. And they'll wear this recorder for 24 hours a day for 2 weeks. I'll be in an exhibition space containing all the necessary facilities, a toilet, a double bed, an exercise bike, and a table and chair. And I'll eat whenever and whatever the other eats, and I'll have water to drink whenever I please. Otherwise, I'm free to do as I like, as long as the VR headset remains on. Much like me, the other is free to do as they wish, as long as their headband stays on and is recording every moment of their life. They're under strict instructions to live their life as normally as possible, considering the circumstances. So this means that they're a real-life person, not some crazy, skydiving, daredevil celebrity. No, they're a relatively boring, real-life human being, much as we all are, except they'll lead a very different life to mine. So we're currently in the process of trialling lots of different others, with our most recent trial run being at Ars Electronica in September this year, where I wore a VR headset for 9 hours a day for 7 days, where I experienced a different person's life each day. So we trialled a range of people, from an 18-year-old girl who got her A-level results the day before filming, to a 27-year-old male farmer, to a 71-year-old woman. At Ars Electronica, we also trialled working with a clinical psychologist who was monitoring me at all times, whilst I also wore a biometric harness which was developed by Ravensbourne University, which monitored my real-time movements, body temperature, heart rate, and galvanic skin response, my sweat, basically. All in all, it's a very successful trial run, an exhibition, and is leading us very well into next year for the real thing. So yeah, we're trialling different people at the moment, so we can come back to this in the conversation if we want to talk about it. But it's quite a short presentation, really, so I'd rather talk about the concepts of Seeing Eye rather than production and logistics of it. So at this point, I'd like to say a very special thank you to Arbeit Gallery, who have been the primary funders and supporters of Seeing Eye up until Ars Electronica, and also, along with a thank you to the Sundance Institute, Mindfulness Centre of Excellence, and Ravensbourne University for their support too. But yeah, so I'll be wearing a VR headset for 24 hours a day for 14 days. So I'll be unable to see my own hands or hear my own voice or have any human contact for the 2 weeks that this is taking place. Most importantly, though, I won't have any form of human interaction to act as a reference point to validate any questions, desires, or thoughts I may have, whilst the only stimulation being what the other sees, and their voice and actions being my constant narration, How will the lifestyle and personality of this other person start to affect my movements, mannerisms, personality, memory, but most importantly, my rationale, how I think? And what happens if over the course of the 2 weeks, I start to believe that I'm not just present, as we saw with Ars Electronica, but the reality that I'm experiencing is my reality, and that I start to believe that I am this other person? Even if momentarily, for 1 minute, I start to believe that I'm this other person, whose identity is it? Is it their identity, or is it my identity? Without agency to determine and shape who we are, will the notion of consciousness, my consciousness, be enough to counteract what I'm seeing and hearing for 2 weeks? Because fundamentally, I would argue that if you're able to condition and alter the way someone thinks, the way I think, then I would argue that you fundamentally change who that person is. And this is what I think happens in society. So the VR headset is a metaphor for the wider physical world. And in a very simplified way, this is how I see the world functioning. On the right-hand side of this is the internet, the influence of which should never be ignored, both positively and negatively. And on the left-hand side of this is the real world, so to speak. And this is a fairly simple understanding of how I think the predominant social structures rule the majority of the collective's world and reality. So at the top of this, we've got the establishment. The establishment was a term used by Henry Fairley in the 1950s to describe how the elite networks at the top of British society closed down ranks to protect their own fundamental interests. So at the top of this, bankers and media, you could probably name a few other people, the economy, if you want to be a bit abstract with it. And then below, just above autonomy, I would place politicians and politics. And then you come to society, what we collectively deem to be socially acceptable. That's to say, the cultural and legal norms are the main influences on people's conduct and moral beliefs. Historically, the moral and ethical code of law has been dictated by the establishment. But over the last 100 years or so, we've started to see a shift in which what we, the collective of individuals, deem to be socially acceptable, beginning to feed into law. And we see this mostly with rights. We see this in growing women's rights, the civil rights movements, LGBTQ+ rights, amongst others. But one important thing to note about rights is the relationship between law and rights. Laws enable rights. And the core of any code of law is in the restrictions placed on attitudes, behaviours, and freedoms. Rights offer the ruling government. Rights offer the freedoms that the ruling government allow the individual to have, and in return, the individual is to be grateful for the privileges that they're offered. Whilst the potential of legal reform will always enable a perception of autonomy, legal reform being the renegotiations of the rights restricted on the individual. And then you come to education. And in school, we're taught the value of the winners in history, society, but more importantly, we're taught the structures through which we'll deem ourselves to be a success or failure. In the UK, we go to school from the ages of 4 till 18, and we're taught that during those years, that to succeed in our exams is tantamount to individual fulfilment. But these grades are standardised so that we must actively beat our peers in order to succeed, meaning we measure our own success against the failure of others. And this system is fundamentally built to determine and shape the expectation of the individual through a structure that needs both winners and losers to exist. And of course, the expectations we have of life are dictated by how we measure success. A male, working class, born in China has a very different set of ideological expectations than that of a woman born in Saudi Arabia, or a white, middle-class male born in the United Kingdom. But as the rigidity of social inequality is firmed, philosophical discourse will always be confused with success and individualism within a system that entrenches the individual above all else. And of course, this stems from a warped capitalist mentality bred through a neoliberal ideology, overlaid with a free market mentality that's been adopted by every society, nearly every society in the world, ensuring that wealth and power remain fixed and unequally distributed. So to use a somewhat extreme example to highlight the power of wealth, or the lack of it, on the 4th of August in 2011, in North London, a 29-year-old black man named Mark Duggan was shot and killed by the police as quite clearly wrongful and incorrect allegations of terrorism. Protests, which focused on Mark Duggan's shooting, along with how black people are treated by the police, were held in Tottenham Hale. And by the 6th of August, 2 days after the initial protests after Mark Duggan's wrongful killings, the protest had turned into riots. Over the next 9 days, The riots had spread across to other cities in England, and in London specifically, the police had lost control over the people. Boris Johnson, the then Mayor of London, responded to this by purchasing illegal water cannons with taxpayers' money as a means of, and I quote, ensuring future autonomy. So by the 15th of August, 11 days after the initial protest over Mark Duggan's wrongful killings, the riots had essentially come to a close. Nearly 4,000 arrests had been made, with 885 for disorder and 67 for arson. There were 5 deaths and at least 16 injuries. There was also an estimated £200 million worth of property damage. But for me, what stood out was that just under 2,300 people were prosecuted for theft. So what initiated out of political and ideological protest at the unjust murder of a young black man via collective individual power was turned into material gain and instant self-gratification. London lost sight of its motives and instead wreaked havoc in pursuit of that shiny new TV or new Air Force One trainers. So I can see why people call this a riot, but I call it a protest because it obviously was. It was made up of people predominantly from less wealthy backgrounds and council estates around London, and they were fed up. What originated out of frustration at being treated differently from other, more privileged people turned into theft. But what they were stealing were the signifiers of success and happiness that capitalism has their whole life told them to aspire to, and their whole lives they've been denied. The structure of protest exists as a means of displaying dissent, but it's only permitted by the government so long as 6 days' notice is given and a route and timescale is published. So what should be a proactive, self-validating, important civil action appears to merely be the illusion of empowerment. Because what options are made available to the public once protests have been approved and completed, but ultimately ignored? Riots are protests born from frustration at the decision and behaviours of those who hold governance and a lack of alternative recourse. Protests, and this kind of action, allow the public a vent for frustration, a show of self-worth, but when it's rooted in genuine emotion by a large enough collective of individuals, riots emerge due to a lack of alternative options, at which point frustration becomes aggression. And this frustration is directed at a system which takes values in objects which are fundamentally beyond the reach of those protesting. So the natural act of protest is to undermine that system. The act of stealing, in this instance, undermines consumerism. And in a system that determines your social order in part based on wealth, the gestural appearance of wealth is key. Because wealth is a signifier of success, and to show it is validation. Eating at restaurants which others can't afford to eat at is a gesture. So are your hobbies, interests, and choices made in your personal and professional life. Your culture, essentially, is a manifestation of your wealth. And this is where I think you begin, where I begin, where individuality is allowed to take place. Because individuality is evident to a degree in the choices we make with our money, but to make that show of affluence is something that's already been decided for us by the time we have the money to show off. Because by that point, we're so used to having been funneled down through such a linear path of life that the only real differences between you and I are aesthetic, surface-level divergences on cultural and political ideologies. This provides us with agency, but only within a parameter we're free to move within but never exceed, not that we have the power to exceed it on our own anyway. But this parameter of individuality, I would say, is really only over our tastes. The taste in the clothes and music we buy, our taste in which political party we support, or our slight slant on a historically Western Christian moral compass. Our individuality exists, but only within the shadows of society. So in 1952, a scientist called Claude Shannon made an artificially intelligent mouse which he called Thesis, in the hopes of demonstrating the possibilities of AI at that point. Thesis was an electronic mouse that would navigate its way to a pre-designated point. Once completed, if it was placed anywhere on that maze, it would remember the route and go back to that designated point. Now, I think it's a common misconception that Thesis, or indeed the programmer of Thesis, were the autonomous ones, because I don't think they were. It's the person who makes the maze and the person who decides to place Thesis within the maze. Thesis's movements Thesis movements are limited to left, right, forwards, and backwards, and is limited to what options are made available to it and acts accordingly to a set of pre-designated rules. Now, in the 21st century, how different are we to thesis? We're thrust into this world with our final destination already determined. We have the choice of which route we may take, but we don't make the decisions of what forwards and backward means, nor did we ever choose to get dropped into this maze. And linking this directly back to seeing eye and the VR headsets, Wittgenstein teaches us that we assume that the physical world, as accessed by our senses, is the real world. The senses which are most readily accessed in day-to-day life are sight and sound. And this is where the notion of a VR headset as a metaphor for the wider physical world is rooted. We access the world presented to us in virtual reality by the same means that we access the physical world. And in this physically domesticated world, which has been artificially altered and curated to the needs of man, we all live in square boxes. We look out of our windows and see square gardens. Beyond our hedges, man has built every building, road, park, and field. Mechanically and physically, our audio-sensory experience have been engineered. From the creak of a floorboard to church bells ringing to an engine revving, none of this exists without man's influence. Even the sound and feeling of the wind that we feel is influenced by the man-made surroundings that we've built, and this is before we mention man's influence on the environment itself. So imagine a world in which we have no senses, in which we're deprived of sensation and unaware of our surroundings. We become numb to the world and numb to the fact that our experiences are fiction and simulated. We believe this fiction to be truth because it's the only experience we know, and at that point we assume that the physical world is the real world, and there the simulation becomes life. We submerge ourselves and surrender ourselves to manufactured sensory input, standing in Plato's cave, facing the wall and naming the shadows, oblivious to the fire outside. And then there's the other. Now, I always feel like I shouldn't talk too much about the other, as potentially vocalizing my conceptual thoughts on them could alter not only their behavior, but also whether they participate at all. But the idea of broadcasting your life is something that, whilst maybe scary on paper, is something we're moving to. And this is symptomatic of an erosion to privacy and anonymity we're seeing more and more, and a seeming rejection of something that we once thought of as a fundamental human right. And social media obviously has its part to play in this. And the appeal of social media is that it turns us all into celebrities and magnifies our desires for others to be impressed by or jealous of our lives. Celebrities have their data catalogued online for them by journalists and the like. But we have to do it ourselves, up to a point when people start taking our online activity, sharing it, quoting it, passing it off as their own even, and that's where these little endorphins start firing. Because we're not manufacturing a facsimile of digital fame at this point. It's something which we've cultivated, and it's self-perpetuating. But for the viewer on the other side, much like when we watch a film, we peer through the window into the protagonist's life. And for the 2 hours that we're watching the film, we suspend our disbelief. We trick ourselves to a certain extent that what we're seeing is reality. We watch the sequential moments of their lives documented and edited. But when documenting the real world, just as when we're being watched, we consciously and subconsciously consider our actions through the potential reception of our audience, which results in a particular social behaviour being entrenched. But when we understand and shape the world in our own somewhat distinct image, with each experience informing the next, as more and more of those experiences are shared with strangers and loved ones alike, it follows that there'll be an effect on how you process and remember those experiences in memories. Michel Foucault said, when the prisoner doesn't know when he's being observed, he becomes his own guardian. And I expect this to be the case with the other. When our identities and behaviours and conversations are played publicly, and every moment potentially seen by others, it only allows for conformity to political, social, and philosophical ideals, norms, and thought processes, as our individual experiences are no longer individual. So then very quickly, the notion of whether the other is performing arises, as they're no longer truly free in their action, as everything is being watched by me, an all-seeing and all-knowing stranger. But then the other is in control of my experience, what I'm thinking, what I'm doing, and ultimately my being. But I am the guardian, and I'm observing everything. But they're self-censoring because of it. So we get stuck in this loop, which is fundamentally rooted in who is in control, the other or me. I constructed this reality, but have surrendered all agency, whilst the other has full autonomy and is yet restricted by the potential acknowledgement of every action and conversation. So who is the autonomous one becomes at once entirely irrelevant, as we both exist within our realities, alone but together. Whilst at the same time, who is the autonomous one becomes the fundamental question, is without agency, who are we? So to bring you to the final line of the trailer that we started with, if our consciousness is experienced through the perception of sight and sound, through interaction, through technology, and through our conception of knowledge, to what extent is it really our own? Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. That was incredibly interesting. As the next move, I think we will open up to some questions. I have a few. I'm sure the audience has a few questions. Before we move on to our next speaker, if I could just get a heads up on timing when we should move on, that'd be great. Thanks. So thank you for your presentation. I had some questions about seeing eye. In fact, I had a class on Monday with a bunch of students, design students at Artes, and they saw the video you showed us, and they were really eager to ask some questions. So I act as a proxy now for these questions. And one of them was, what do you dream in this experiment, whether it's the 24-hour one or the 7-day one? What are your dreams?
It's a good question. Dreams are something I'm particularly interested in. But it's hard to have judged really from the trials that we've done, because sorry for the disappointing answer to this, but a lot of the stress has been in the production of this, and then the actual doing of it, there were still lots of stresses in between, so my mind wasn't quite in the right headspace for dreaming. But I'm very interested in what these dreams are like for the real thing. That where is this personality? Where am I going to with it? But now I have a disappointing answer for that. So.
No, that's still interesting. In that it's quite tense. I think what you're saying, the whole experience itself is it's not a relaxing, restful experience. There's moments we see you in the bed, resting up against a headrest, and then you're eating a piece of chocolate or fish and chips at some stage. But what you're saying now is it's quite stressful.
It is very stressful. It's a very strange place being in there, watching it for 9 hours or 24 hours or 92 was the longest we've done, continuous hours. It's so amazing. One of the things that I find is that my mind goes blank. However much I try to think about something, this forceful, intrusive kind of stimulation that I can't escape from really doesn't allow me to kind of choose where my mind goes. And it's just blank to then what they're seeing and what they're doing. And I'd like to see how that progresses, really, as the project.
So immediately after the 7 days, I think there were 2, right? There was a 7-day at Ars Electronica, and then there was a 24-hour test before.
And many others in between. Yeah.
Okay. What is your immediate feelings after the headset comes off and you're kind of walking out of the space? What is that immediate post-VR effect?
I tend to get dizzy when I take it off immediately. I tend to get the motion sickness that a lot of people get whilst they're in it, but I get that afterwards. And one of the problems that we found from longer trial runs, and I think this might be rooted in this, is that because my horizon line when I'm in VR is different to my real life horizon line, and I'm wearing sound cancelling headphones, my balance is starting to get thrown off, and there's a build-up of wax in my ears, which then is the issue. That's actually our main issue now with the longer version, is how do we confront that? But in terms of taking it off and kind of the freedom that I have, I most like just talking to people and being acknowledged. Because there I'm so forgotten and alone and sad, really, at times, that it's nice to just have a reference to reality, or me, or Mark Farid, so to speak.
So is there someone ready to give you a hug afterwards?
Yeah, for the trial run, my girlfriend was there to then come, yeah.
Was that something you did straight afterwards? Some sort of human physical touch? Or?
Yeah, so for Ars Electronica, we had a clinical psychologist who was on board, so then she would immediately come, kind of give me a hug, touch my leg whilst we're then talking about kind of going through the kind of regimented kind of how did you feel here, how many times did you do this, how many times did that. And yeah, there was a lot of... But for Ars Electronica, it was a strange one because it's so public and it's such a taking it off each day. It becomes slightly theatrical in that process, when in the real thing it happens once behind closed doors, where I'm sat in a dark room for quite a while, letting my eyes adjust to kind of natural light. But yeah, so it's at that moment in time I want physical contact, an acknowledgement of my existence.
Lots to think about there. I'd like to just extend this opportunity to you for questions. Here in the front row, Annika?
Yes, hi. Thanks for the very interesting presentation. Continuing the question of the on the dreams, what's the aftermath of these experiences actually that you have?
So with Ars Electronica specifically, because it was 7 days over, I found that coming out of it, quite surprising, well I guess quite surprising, but also maybe not, I found that I wanted to be quite isolated and alone from people, contrary to kind of I wanted that physical acknowledgement. But over the month after, well, the month that just passed, I found that I became quite a social hermit, and I didn't really want to see anyone, and I just kind of wanted to be alone and just be by myself, which I think makes sense considering we're social beings. And then I've just so removed myself for 7 days that that was kind of my main takeaway in terms of how it affected me, those 7 days. But as it was 9 hours a day, it's a long time, but also it's not. You know, it's a working day. It's like you go to work, you come back, cool, I've done my job for that day. And that's where it's inherently a very different thing to the real thing. Because it's continuous, it's waking up with it, it's sleeping with it, it's not having any point to be me. And that's kind of then where the dreams come in, that because I've had, 16 hours, how many hours it is, that 15 hours to be myself, that the dreaming where me losing myself doesn't really happen in these trial runs. It's happened in 92-hour trial runs that we do, but never the kind of shorter, more public versions.
Okay, I'm afraid we're out of time for these questions, but we're going to have some more time at the end, the very end, where we can really relax and ask more. So thank you, Mark. We'll move on to our next speaker, and we'll bring you back at the end. Thank you. Okay, so swiftly moving on to Miguel Ángel Rego, who is an artist and researcher based in Madrid, and he studied fine art at the Complutense University in Spain, and is currently finishing his PhD at the Spanish National Research Council. He is no stranger to the Netherlands. He studied his master's here in art and praxis at the Dutch Art Institute in Arnhem, and he has exhibited his projects in Spain and further abroad, and frequently gives lectures on his research. So please take the floor, Miguel.
So, okay. Thanks everyone for coming. First of all, I would like to give my gratitude to the organization, the volunteers, and above all, to the curators, Jan, Marloes, and Barbara, and the director, Arjun, for inviting me here. It's a pleasure to hear, and also for trusting in my work. Okay, what I wanted to do here today is to present a text I wrote time ago, a text that it was published in Open Online. Maybe you know it because it's a publication based here in the Netherlands, a digital publication. And basically, what I've done in this text is to present my current interests and how I am developing these interests through my artistic practice. So basically, the main focus of this text is based on the theory of one philosopher named Thomas Metzinger. For those who don't know him, Thomas Metzinger is a neurophilosopher who has coined a complex concept called the phenomenal self model, or the PSM, as I will mention it during the presentation. My proposal here is to explain it in an easy way, to make it more understandable for the audience, and to present some artworks in order to explain it And yes, let's do it. So what is the phenomenal self-model? For Metzinger, the phenomenal self-model, the PSM, is an efficient way to allow biological organism to consciously conceive of itself as a whole. What does it mean? For me, it would be a kind of process, internal process of all human beings that gives sense of that our body is our own body, that our feelings are our own feelings, that our thoughts are our own thoughts. And okay, this is really abstract, but through a property that mentions Thomas Metzinger's in his theory, the transparency is gonna be more clear. For Metzinger, transparency is the way in which we, all human beings, interrelate with the world that surrounds us. We are unconscious of all neurons, of all brain mechanisms activated in the brain during our actions. Because otherwise it wouldn't be possible to interrelate with the world. To make an easy example, if I would be conscious of all mechanisms inside of my brain activating in my brain, I couldn't do this presentation for you. So there would have a kind of obstacle. So these neurons, these mechanisms inside of our brain present to us in a transparent form. For Metzinger, he would say that all these neurons firing away in our brain, we don't see these neurons, but only what they represent for us. So the PSM, in standard conditions, is what I've told to you. But what happens when we are in non-standard situations? Like, for instance, what I'm gonna show you through this video.
To show you how that works, Jonah's recreating a classic psychology experiment.
The rubber hand illusion is a funny hack of the brain where you can convince people very quickly that this rubber arm is actually their own arm.
He's setting up a stand at Venice Beach, where he'll test volunteers to see if they can experience sensations in a hand that's not theirs.
Welcome to the rubber hand experience. I want you to put your left hand right here and put your right hand right here.
Jonah has participants hide their right hand out of sight behind a divider.
Just gonna drape this so as if it's your real hand.
While he places a rubber hand on the table in front of them.
Just stare at this hand.
Jonah primes participants by brushing both the fake and real hand simultaneously, a process which helps the brain link the feeling to the fake arm.
I feel like you're doing that to my hand, but that's not my hand. My hand's over there, so that's kind of weird.
That's kind of weird.
Now that Jonah has linked this volunteer's brain to the new hand, he's got an even bigger surprise for her.
So here you've seen that the PSM is recognizing the rubber hand as part of our own. So external entities can be part of our own if the PSM recognizes. So in these kind of situations, like for instance this illusion, other situations like the so-called out-of-body experiences, virtual reality even can produce these rare neuronal pathologies also. The first feature I would like to present that is characterized in the PSM is Mineness ownership. I'm going to introduce 3 different characteristics in order to understand what is the PSM. So Mineness ownership for Metzinger is the internality of experiencing bodily sensations, like for instance fearness, happiness, madness, and they are part of our own. Sometimes we can feel these sensations also unconsciously. And other times, we can produce a bodily sensation through virtual reality, for instance. I'm going to show a little excerpt of Harun Farooqi's work, Serious Games 3, only a little excerpt because this work is included in the next section, in the medical subject field program, and yeah, I'm going to explain it afterwards.
You're doing great. Tell me what's happening. What do you see when you go to Jones?
So I get over to where he's at, and it's like just, you know, from like his knees up, and that's like all that's there, and there's flesh and there's blood and there's and bits of uniform, and it's it was him, and I'm like, shit. So at that point I'm just like freaking out. I'm like, you know, thinking I'm gonna die, that, you know, this was not a good idea. Why the hell are we out here doing this? And then I start hearing some gunfire down the street, and so I'm like, you know, hell, what am I gonna do? So I find some place and I just duck and I get behind there and I just kind of curl up into a ball, and I'm covering my head and everything, and I'm just seriously like, I'm freaking out. And, you know, I tell him I'm gonna puke, and I remember saying that. I told him I was gonna puke, and he I don't remember, he said something like, well, don't do it on me, or something like that, and I was like, well, that was pretty cold, and I was like, why can't we get out of here? Why are we yelling, and why are we being, you know, like that?
Are you getting sick? Are you puking there?
Like right now?
No, there, when you're there.
I didn't actually puke, but yeah, I felt like I was going to. I really did, and I was like, I'm kind of feeling it now, actually.
Okay, you're doing great. Tell me what's happening now. And when do you see someone again?
It was a long. I don't. Can we stop?
Yeah, you're doing a great job. You know, we need to stay with it. How long are you there before you see someone?
Do I have to be here that long?
Yeah. Tell me how long you're there before you see someone. You're doing a great job, Kevin. This is what we need to do.
I don't know, but it felt like forever. You know, like there were.
You're doing great. Stay with it. So tell me what happens when he sees you.
I don't want to do this anymore.
I want you to stay in it and tell me you're doing a great job. This is what we need to do. Tell me what happens when he sees you.
People get worse doing this.
No, you're doing great. Tell me what happens when he sees you.
So in this video, we've seen an US soldier who participated in the Second Iraq War, and he's looking through the virtual reality goggles, the same landscapes and experiences he experienced before. So despite I've been talking about Thomas Metzinger in a kind of objective way, because he's referring above all to the neurons and brain mechanisms, we have to consider that human being, epistemically objective aspect and the subjective. We are containers of experiences. For instance, if I would see these images through these goggles, for me wouldn't be the same feeling, the same sensation as the soldier. So this is the first characteristic that characterizes the PSM, the phenomenal self model. The second one is perspectivalness or location. For Metzinger, perspectivalness or location is how our conscious experience is tied to an individual first-person perspective. So in standard situations, we have our conscious experience in this first-person perspective. But what happens sometimes when we dream? We sometimes look at the world from other perspective, from the outside. And in these so-called out-of-body experiences, these experiences that suffer people with brain damages, they see themselves from above. So what I would like to present here is a project made by Melanie Gilligan, The Common Sense, a little excerpt, in which in a science fiction film series format, she's presenting two different near futures. Two different near futures in which a company launches to the market a device called the patch that is inserted in the mouth. And through this device, you can exchange experiences with other people in a kind of real virtuality experience. So, I'm going to present it.
to show you.
All through human history, we've wanted to connect. In the beginning, there was the patch one way. The one way is about experiencing someone else's emotions in real time. When someone else's feelings change how you feel, it can change your world. With the two-way, we've found a way to take it to a whole new level. Your brainwaves will send at the same time as you receive. With the two-way, we can act and create together. We don't know where this will lead. It's a new design for the human being, and it's for you to find out.
I have been waiting for this day for 3 years. I would like to present to you the two-way. The first two-way entrainment device where users send their experience and receive at the same time. We have overcome incredible obstacles, hardware and software design to bring this product to the market today. This device is going to blow your mind.
Well, the difficulty is that 70% of people have been left out of the production of goods and services in the economy, and only 20% of those people have been able to find work through the patch.
Okay, let me walk you through your contract. Signing this, you agree that the device will be left as inserted for the fixed term of 9 months. Transmissions from your womb to third parties will be the private information of Juvie. Any medical, emotional, or employment-related events that may occur. Please move mat A.
And what will this mean for our strategy?
Now this guy, he's using the device, the patch.
Hey!
And he's in a way disconnected from his physical experience. This would be a kind of next level in the social media panorama, a kind of near future. And finally, what is agency and selfhood, the third characteristic of the PSM. For Metzinger, agency is the self, the notion of the self over time. What does it mean? When we think about our near future, when we are talking to ourselves internally, when we remember things of our childhood, these simulations in our brain are part of our own. But what happens when agency is manipulated or is even manipulated by some neuronal pathologies, like, for instance, one that I'm going to introduce, that is anosognosia. Anosognosia is a rare pathological, a neuronal pathology that provokes to the patients the denial of other illnesses. I mean, for instance, this pathology is provoked in the right side of the brain, sorry, and with a damage of something in the right side of the brain, you can also have left side paralysis. So anosognosia provokes that you deny that you have left side paralysis. So patients, for instance, with the doctor, when the doctor asks for pointing out with the left hand to his nose, they are saying that they are doing it, but they are not moving anything. So they are affirming that they are doing the action, but they are not doing. So let's say that anosognotic patients fill in explanatory gaps with inaccurate information when accurate information is not available. This is a kind of self-agency. And what I've done here in order to illustrate this property, this characteristic agency, is to work with some patients suffering from anosognosia. And I represented it in a video that is also included in the medical subject film program. I'm gonna show you only a little excerpt. And also I invite you to assist to the film program in order to see entirely. This piece is called Post-Contingent Coherence, and you've seen a pianist playing a piece of piano by Chopin. And maybe you realized in first-person perspective images, you see how the pianist is playing perfectly with her two hands, but in the third-person perspective images, she is taking her left hand with the right one in order to play perfectly. So there are two realities happening at once, coming from the same person. This is this kind of self-agency that provokes anosognosia. And yeah, finally, I would say that these are these three characteristics of the PSM, and yeah, that's all what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Miguel, thank you. Take a seat. I must say, I think I would be your perfect rubber hand participant. I felt it from there. I even went when the hammer came out, even though I thought maybe the hammer will come out. I thought maybe this hammer would come out at some point, right? But I was still shocked when it happened. And it brought me to a thought, actually, are there some people more susceptible to these kind of experiences of embodiment or virtual embodiment than others?
I don't know exactly if there are Sorry. I don't know exactly because I'm more focused on these rare pathologies. What I would say about the people suffering from this kind of pathologies, for instance, is with this kind of experiments, you can have different, how do you call it? Different approximations of what they suffer. I mean, for instance, there are some people suffering anosognosia that, for instance, if you ask for, if they have to, I don't know, they ask for tying their shoes, and they are still trying to tie their shoes for 2 hours, for instance, but they are gonna deny this thing for hours. Other people suddenly say, okay, I cannot do it. So there are different degrees, I would say, of these illnesses, these pathologies. And for instance, I think with this, with virtual reality, it will be the same. It depends, I think, on the question of how the PSM recognizes specific parts of the reality or not. Because for me, the most interesting part of this pathology, anosognosia, is how we all suffer anosognosia in a kind of degree. Because in specific moments of our lives, I don't know, for instance, if someone, a relative, dies, we need to deny a specific part of the reality in order to confront, in order to face it. This is a process in the vestibular system that is empirically proved, and this is what interests me, how these evident manifestations are part of everybody as human beings.
So maybe, could you unpack that? I wasn't sure I understood that. That there's a moment where you have to deny a certain response in being able to manage a situation, or, for example, in a grieving situation, or in this moment of trauma where we saw with the US soldier, which, by the way, I found very difficult to watch. I thought it was a very aggressive video. It was really hard to watch. That you somehow deny a certain part of yourself to be able to cope with the situation, or?
It is interesting. It is interesting because in the case of the US soldier, we see how...
I cannot hear you. You have to really talk in...
Sorry, yeah. It is interesting because you are talking about two things that appeared in the presentation. First of all, the US soldier like experiencing the trauma, the previous situations in the Iraq War, and then how he can deny some parts of this reality. I think there is another factor that is time. I think this project was made in like 2 or 3 years after the war, so these moments of trauma are more like connected. The affective stuff is more connected with him. Yeah.
Can I ask the audience if there's one quick question before we move on, and then we will come back to any other questions at the end. Does anyone have a question they'd like to ask Miguel right now? Okay, then I will save my other questions to at the end. I have a few more. Thank you so much for your presentation. You may have noticed we have 3 M's today. So we've had Mark, we've had Miguel, and now we have the last M, Mavi. So I would like to introduce Mavi because indeed tonight she's doing a keynote, which I encourage you to also attend. And as a scientist, Dr. Mavi Sánchez-Vives studies how our brain represents the outside world and our body. She's the chief medical officer in her lab based in Barcelona called Virtual Bodyworks. And she experiments with virtual reality as a tool so convincing that the user feels fully embodied and present in a virtual environment. The bodies in this context are reconfigured to be present in a realm where they do not physically reside. According to Mavi, here lies the potential to achieve not only a change of environment, but also a change of the self. And specifically, she's been working with case studies of domestic abuse, where she explores how to develop virtual embodiment into forms of therapy. She has a very impressive academic CV. It's way too long to mention here, but just to say that she's also the professor in the Department of Basic Psychology and co-director of the Event Lab at the University of Barcelona, and editor-in-chief of the journal Frontiers in Systems Neuroscience. Please put your hands together for Dr. Mavi Sánchez-Vives.
Thanks very much. It's a great pleasure to be here, especially after these two very thought-provoking talks. And actually, well, my talk is much shorter, just to give some ideas to move on to the discussion. And actually, the ideas that I want to put forward, they are extremely connected to the two previous talks. However, my expertise is rather on the scientific side, but I have been working with the same concepts that we have been hearing. So I would just like to tell you the technique that we use is immersive virtual environments. I know you are all familiar with this, but what we have seen in the previous talks, for example, is a rather 360 video. And what I refer to is virtual reality, which is generated by a computer. So it's a 360 reality that surrounds people, is where one experiences it with a stereoscopic vision. Therefore, in 3D, there is an update to the position of the head of the images that are being displayed, and therefore the objects are three-dimensional and one can walk around them, which is not something that is normally possible in 360 video, and therefore the body can be fully tracked. And it's a very immersive and situation that I will show to you how we can use it in order to induce body ownership. Here, this photo that I took, it represents the multisensory aspect to it. So ideally, virtual reality is more effective if there is a multisensory correlation. So therefore, not only visual information, even when we know it's rather dominant, but it's good if there is very good audio, but also if there is tactile correlation, such that this is more difficult, but when we go to touch something, we feel this touch, or we feel the wind, as you can see in the image here, or eventually even there can be smells, or there can be even taste. Usually when there is some kind of gastronomical virtual environments, there is exploration about this, such that one can eat virtual foods, let's say. So it's multisensory is important, it works better. And an interesting aspect of virtual reality that well, it was running before, but it's not really necessary. This is a small video I took in actually in a mall, and what it shows is the point that I want to make is that in spite of the fact that we know that virtual reality is not real, we respond to it as if it were real. And this is very critical because not only because I'm a scientist and we like to measure, and we measure behavior, we measure heart rate, we measure the physiology, as it was mentioned, we measure the skin conductance response and so on, but it's very important because when virtual reality is used for therapies, for example, as we have seen before also for post-traumatic stress disorder therapy, it's important that one responds as if it were real. This is, if we would just say, oh yeah, I don't believe it, this that makes nothing to me, then it would not have this interest. So in this video, these kids that are getting this very multisensory information, they are screaming like crazy because probably they are in some roller coaster or so. So I just wanted to say that if we consider self-consciousness that contains an internal representation of the world, an internal representation of the body, and some autobiographical nature, all these layers, actually, they are aspects that we can manipulate in virtual reality. We can work obviously on a different representation of the world. We can work, as I will show you very briefly, on an internal representation of the body. And eventually, one have like long exposures like we have here to Mark before, and we provide some kind of information, or even if one opens up their eyes in the morning and they are already in a virtual environment, we can create an autobiographical information. So all of this can happen in virtual reality. And one is the internal representation of the world, which is obvious. We can be in other places. I won't go into this. If someone is interested in science, we wrote a long article about this a few years ago, From Presence to Consciousness. But what I want just to mention here is about the internal representation of the body. So the perception of the body is very important, obviously, to experience oneself. So even when we have this idea that what the self is something else, actually, I can tell you from our empirical observations for many years working with virtual bodies that our body is really important to determine how we are, how we respond, and so on. So I was going to show to you the rubber hand illusion, but I will not do it. But I will tell you that actually this was when I started using virtual reality for neuroscience in the early 2000s, and I was working on perception at the time. But then I read about the rubber arm illusion. And I became very interested not only on perception, which was my original interest because I was studying the brain mechanisms for sensory processing and sensory perception, but then I realized that it was very interesting perception, not so much of the outside world, but perception of the self. So there are many body illusions. One is the rubber hand illusion that you saw in the previous talk. Another one, there are many, as I say, but for example, one is the Pinocchio illusion. So it's something that, as you can see, it doesn't require any technology. You can do it if you want. But basically, your brain is very, very pragmatic. And there is not a preformed conception of how is your body. Basically, if there is a proper correlation, and if you do like this, and you touch your nose, and you feel it, your brain is going to assume that this is because you have now a very long nose. So, and therefore, this is the basis of why we observe that actually the body representation is extremely plastic, because as far as you provide correct visotactile correlations, for example, for some reasons before all the videos were running and not now, but again, this is just a visotactile correlation. So as far as there are certain rules that are followed, your brain is going to be normally very flexible about which bodies to accept. So this one is running here. You can see how someone has this first-person perspective. You look down. In the real world, when you look down, you have always your whole life seen your body. And then when you look down and you see a different body, and this body moves with you, and you feel what this body touches, and so on, then your brain says, well, this is my body, but it doesn't matter whether the body is different gender, different race, different size, different age. It is super flexible, and what body can be on. So this is my last slide. I won't tell you about this, but just some ideas of what we have been observing in the virtual reality explorations of the body representation during these years. So as I said, the internal representation of the body is very plastic, but there have to be certain rules. Otherwise, the illusion is broken. The body that we are given in a VR experimental environment is going to have an impact on the self, on how we behave, how we respond. We can feel agency even for actions that we don't command. So if our body does something, and it is our body, your brain is going to say, well, this was my action, I gave this order. And we have evidence of this, and it's published in scientific papers, so it's like that. We can, of course, generate out-of-the-body experiences, so we can play around this concept of where the self is. And very interestingly is that we can be someone else. We can take the perspective of someone else, be in another body, and see the reality from that perspective. And this is going to give us a rich experience of how other people feel about it. And we can also see ourselves from the inside, from the outside. So actually we do this now because we can generate avatars based on scanning the real person. This is philosopher Daniel Dennett in our lab. You can see your own avatar, and actually you can have a conversation with yourself, which is very interesting to see you from another perspective. So that's all. Thanks.
If I could ask all our speakers to join me on stage here. Yes. Okay. We have time for questions, so I'd like to open it up to you, the audience, for our three speakers. Just to say also thank you, Mavi, for your presentation. That was incredibly interesting. Yes, right at the back, kind of in the middle. Just wait a second for the microphone.
Oh, this one. Yeah, hi. I was wondering if you have ever experienced lucid dreams.
Who's your question directed at?
Well, actually, kind of all of you, because I was interested in how virtual reality, that's, you know, it's not really real, but your body experiences it as real. And kind of with lucid dreaming, you know that you're dreaming, but your body still kind of reacts to what's happening in your dreams. So I was wondering if Mrs. Sánchez-Vives, if you have ever kind of also studied that or came in contact with that.
Yeah, I haven't studied it. I have tried personally to do it and been successful a couple of times. There are some points of connection that basically, there is people that do research on lucid dreaming, and the first thing they need to do is to learn to do systematically lucid dreaming if one wants to do an experimentation with it. So this is like the first part of the people that do a PhD on lucid dreaming is to get trained to do proper lucid dreaming, and then you can do experimentation. I have never done it from this, with this objective. In that sense, I think it's much easier to deal with virtual reality because also it's not you have a complete control of the afferences that the person is getting, and therefore you can see how much of it is coming from outside, how much of it is generated by their own brain. So I find it more easier to control. Yeah, but it's very interesting.
There was a question just in front of the last speaker, or just behind. Yeah.
Hi, I was wondering, none of us mentioned the notion of empathy, but for me it seems quite linked. How would you link the notion of empathy to your work, the three of you?
And who are you directing the question at?
Whoever. I think it's quite linked with every research. So.
Okay, it's the question of empathy. Mark, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, it's a good point. It's strange that none of us talked about empathy. We were working with Simon Baron-Cohen, who looks a lot at autism and empathy specifically early on in this project. And empathy was a big part of this, and I think still is, but specifically in terms of my experience, in terms of relation to the other, empathy is a big part of it, and you do get a very real sense after 9 hours, or 24 hours, or 92 hours of this person. But in terms of my personal experience with empathy itself, because I'm not a scientist, so how I'm looking at this is slightly different. More for me, what was my big takeaway and something close to empathy was how well I got to know this person and how clearly their insecurities would come out over a long duration of time, which then allowed me to empathize with them more and understand their situation and why they were acting a certain way. But really it then became more of the intimacy of knowing them, and then that kind of opened it up into kind of a more personal experience as opposed to necessarily empathy itself, I think.
Mavi, do you want to say something about empathy?
Well, I can mention briefly that we have been working for a few years now with in the rehabilitation of domestic violence abusers, because we saw the potential when you are in the body of another person to get to understand both explicitly and implicitly their perspective. And we thought, well, maybe it's useful to be in the perspective of the victim. This can have an effect on the aggressor. And actually, we have. We have worked a lot, and I could talk for a long time, but I won't about this. But this is based on the induction of empathy by being in the perspective of someone else. So we know that there are some implicit changes that contribute to build up this empathy. Like, for example, there are changes in emotion recognition and so on. So it's very linked. So it's in principle, taking the perspective of someone else increases in some way the empathy for this person.
May I just ask a question about that? Surely, just to Mark's point about temporality or kind of time-based empathy, that empathy strikes me as something that has to be conditioned over many habits, rituals, over long periods of time, that it's not something you can simply develop in a 9-hour session or a 30-minute session. How do you account or reconcile that kind of the long vision on empathy with these shorter experiences in VR?
Well, I'm not an expert on empathy, but some of these experiences, you have an implicit learning that sometimes can happen in minutes, and it's quite persistent, I would say. So I'm sure you need more to develop empathy and to act accordingly. But there are some experiences that can make you have an automatic learning, which is not rational, but you can generate some building blocks of empathy, let's say.
Yeah, I had an experience quite early on with testing. I think it's empathy. Empathy is understanding, as far as and it was quite a big moment for me in terms of sexism, in terms of we were trialing different genders and sexualities and races, and came to the conclusion that it doesn't matter. But it was we were doing a woman, and she would be talking and ask a question, and then the group response would answer it more towards the man, or look directly at the man to then answer the question that she asked. And it completely changed it in a very quick understanding of this one minuscule kind of cultural sexism that exists. But it was very clear to me then at that point.
Would anyone in the audience like to respond to that idea? Yes, on the side there.
I'd like another question, so I don't know, maybe if somebody wants to respond to this, they can go first.
No, go for it, it's fine. We can come back, we'll remember.
Okay, yeah, I had like two things to say. One thing about the lucid dreaming, like I wanted to respond, and I have two questions for Mark. So first about the lucid dreaming, I just like it popped in mind that one of the first things to start to learn how to lucid dream is actually to establish like a stable connection between like your body representation and what you're seeing in your dream by looking at your hand, and like your brain cannot make a stable model of your hand, so your fingers will pop in and out, and like it's a bit shaky, and if you see that, then you know that you're dreaming. So that's like one of the starts to learn how to lucid dream. So I think that's very related to the sort of avatar body match in VR. And the question for Mark was like, because if you are experiencing the life of somebody else, would you have like frequent sort of loss of agency because you cannot interact with the world and with other people by your own will? Like, was that creating sort of a conscious distance between you and the person whose things you were seeing? And secondly, were there moments of sort of like a double layer of like virtuality when the person through whose eyes you were looking was like watching TV or like just on their phone doing things? Yeah, that basically.
I'm not sure I understood the second question, but did you, Mark?
I didn't really understand the first question.
Okay, the first question, I think, if I may, is around agency. Is agency still rested in your mind as the artist, or your body, let's say? Or is it somehow taken over by the other? I think, if I understand correctly. Yeah?
Well, yeah, it's the key premise, essentially, of the project is the lack of agency that I have. So it's, although agency of my physical movements and actions and conversations, but I still have agency of my mind. But that is something that seems to be quite numbed by the stimulation and the bright lights, and over time, that restlessness comes out and the frustration at not being able to talk to anyone and not being acknowledged. And that's kind of where, for me, it gets more interesting, is that really the project starts 3 or 4 days in, where that kind of agency's gone, and then it's kind of then how am I rebuilding, or what kind of do I cling on to kind of cope with this, or trick myself into being able to cope. So will I then trick myself into some agency when I don't? When of course I do have some agency. I can go to the toilet, I can walk around, I can talk to myself, which I do, and I do all of those things, but that's really as far as it goes. I think. And in terms of the second question...
I'm not sure I understood the second question, but if we can, I think we have very limited time left. If you don't mind, maybe you can catch Mark afterwards in the coffee area. Okay. Anybody else have a question? Yes, in the middle with the yellow shirt.
Hello. Thanks for sharing your knowledge and for your speech. Actually, as we know, our subconscious mind was programmed when we were child, and based on parents' behavior and actions, schools, friends, and we gain a lot of habits. Some of them are bad habits. How far this technology and VR can be helpful to reprogram our subconscious mind? And if you believe so, when it will be in our life to use it to reprogram our subconscious mind to have to change our bad habits to good habits? This question for all of you.
Thank you.
I'm not sure we are going to get ethics approval to alter your subconscious mind.
The end.
Well, actually, very briefly, when I talk about implicit learning, like, for example, we detect changes in implicit racial bias or gender bias and so on, or emotion recognition, you could say this is in a way reprogramming the unconscious mind, because it's as I call it, automatic. It's something that you don't realize, but it happens by having an experience, like we learn by having experiences in the real world. So maybe this is as far as we can go, but it's interesting. I don't know about changing habits. I guess one could think about strategies for that. Yeah.
Miguel, do you have any thoughts on habit reprogramming?
This, what I would say is what I would say is I am following the work of Mavi, and she's working with domestic violence, gender violence, machist violence. And I think what I bet is for experiencing more and more with this kind of virtual reality, not just only to put in prison these people. This is a big problem for sure, but I think there's a space for experimentation with this virtual reality, not only for changing habits, but also for preventing habits. I think is a good tool, but I cannot say anything about subconsciousness. No, I'm not an expert. Yeah.
Mavi, did you want to add something?
Yeah, well, of course, basically in virtual reality, one can have a whole load of experiences that they can be impossible in real life, or they can be more than in real life. You can be exposed to situations that maybe the probability that you are exposed in the real life is very low, and this can actually, as Miguel was mentioning, you can change habits. So when we train these abusers in the rehabilitation programs, which they are doing the rehabilitation programs, and this is just an additional tool, not only we try to create more empathy and so on, but also to trained into how to respond to situations. So you can be exposed to more situations and learn to respond when you receive a certain stimulus. You can respond violently or non-violently, and so you can, in this way, create habits. I wouldn't dare to talk about changing the unconscious mind of people.
Okay, a question in the center? Just, if you want to... Yeah, wait for a mic, thanks. Thank you.
Okay, hello. I know that I do address this kind of conditioning from traumatic experiences and stuff like that via hypnosis, hypnotic suggestion. Do you know about that, and do you think that is kind of maybe related to this kind of suggestion that you do with VR?
And is your question at somebody particular?
Mavi, please.
I don't know how hypnosis works, actually, so I don't know to what extent it's like hypnosis. Basically, I mean, what I see is, or what I mentioned is that we see some ways where people learn because they live through a situation which is conscious and rational, and they can elaborate explicitly about it and realize that that a behavior is not adequate, or that how someone can feel when they experience this point of view, or how a woman or a man can feel when you are in their shoes, let's say. And then there are these other automatic learnings. I don't know to what extent that's similar to hypnosis, because I'm not familiar with hypnosis.
Okay, we have time for maybe 2 more questions over here.
So, yeah, maybe this question is to Mark. So, I was wondering in general, for like all the talks, a bit about in how far you're like critically, especially ethically engaging with what you're doing. So I kind of missed this a bit. And also, for example, when you were like referring to Harun Faraki and also showing part of his series, Serious Games. And for example, his artistic research was about, showing how war simulations become reality, how virtual reality is used or abused for like producing real wars. And I was wondering, Mark, what you think about your research. So if whatever you're doing could, for example, be like the other way around, be abused for, things you self would find ethically, not okay or whatsoever. So.
Thank you. Yeah.
So the ethics of the project is something that's been a big challenge for this. It's been 5 years of production, but ethical approval, trying to get it, has been 3.5 years, I think, of trying to jump through the boxes, because it is, on paper, quite unethical. So yeah, that's just a very quick thing on the ethical approval side. In terms of the ethics of it being misused, is that the question?
Yes, so how ethically similar situations could be misused?
Yeah, exactly. But also, for example, look what there already is, because this kind of things are also done for, warriors. They are using these methods also to prepare, people who go in war. But then definitely different, because they are like a different person or whatsoever, but the person they will become, probably. So, and then, what you will learn out of your project, and, how this could be misused by people, doing different stuff with this.
I haven't so much thought about the misuse of almost conditioning a person in that sense, but I would then maybe think that it's then important to do it, then see what happens, and whether it can be misused or whether it can't be misused. For me, more the ethical side, not for the ethical approval, but for me, the unethical side, is more the filming people in public. We're filming lots of people, although we know the legal side, although we've got contracts for it. As someone who cares about data privacy myself, that we are filming lots of people without their permission most of the time. And for me, that's where the unethical side, especially then with this recorder that we've developed, which is the first in the world of a first-person point of view recorder for VR stuff that moves, that has battery life for a whole day. And we're open sourcing this at the end of the project, so anyone can do it. You can download the STL and all the software and do it and modify it yourself. And for me, that's more the unethical side. But, yeah.
Okay, that wraps up the number of questions we can take. But of course, our speakers will be around for a little bit longer. So if you would like to approach one of them later, please do. If we could put our hands together for a warm thanks to our speakers. Thank you.